In 1904, a zookeeper in New York City noticed something wrong with the trees. This happened at the New York Zoological Park, what we now call the Bronx Zoo, where a forester named Herman Merkel spotted strange orange cankers spreading across the bark of the park's chestnut trees. Within 2 years, that infection had spread to 98% of every chestnut tree in the borough. Nobody could stop. Scientists tried tree surgery. They tried chemical sprays. They tried cutting isolation strips clear across entire mountain ranges to block its path. Nothing worked. Over the next 4 decades, the blight killed an estimated 3.5 to 4 billion American chestnut trees, wiping out a species that had once made up a quarter of every hardwood tree in the Appalachian Mountains. And buried inside that ecological catastrophe was an industrial one. More than half of every ounce of vegetable tannin used by the American leather industry came from chestnut bark. In Virginia alone, at least 9 major tanneries depended on tens of thousands of cords of chestnut wood every single year. When the trees died, an entire regional industry that had run the same way for over a century lost its raw material almost overnight. That was 1904. But the story of tanning leather starts thousands of years before an Asian fungus ever reached the Bronx, and long before anyone in America had ever built a tannery at all. Human beings have been killing animals for meat since long before recorded history, and every single time, they were left holding a problem. A raw skin rots. Left out in the open, exposed to bacteria and moisture, a fresh hide is unusable within about a week. But skins were valuable. They were warm. They were tough. They could be wrapped around a foot or a shoulder or stretched over a tent frame. So somebody, somewhere, tens of thousands of years ago, discovered by trial and error that if you treated a skin the right way, you could stop the rot completely and turn something that decayed in days into something that could last for centuries. Archaeologists have found bone tools used specifically for scraping hides that date back roughly 400,000 years, unearthed at sites in England and in a cave in Israel, hide processing older than modern humans as we usually picture them. Nobody recorded the first time a human worked animal fat and wood ash into a raw skin and noticed it had stopped smelling like death. But it worked. And once it worked, the knowledge spread and refined itself for tens of thousands of years, long before anyone called it a craft. By the time Egypt rose along the Nile, tanning had become a genuine craft with real chemistry behind it. Egyptian tomb paintings, roughly 5,000 years old, show craftsmen making sandals and clothing out of leather. Egyptian tanners understood more than one method: the slow, bark-based tanning process using the acacia tree, known as gum arabic, which tough, stiff hides, and a separate mineral-based process using alum and sesame oil. Leather was never a luxury in this world. It was infrastructure. Sandals, water skins, harnesses, armor, and eventually parchment for writing all depended on it. But the people who made it were, almost everywhere, treated as beneath the people who used it. Tanning required strong, corrosive substances to strip hair and flesh from a hide, and the substance available in unlimited free supply was urine, human and animal both, collected specifically for the purpose. In the Roman world, that process turned tanner into an insult, a shorthand for something filthy and low. Some ancient writers described tanning workshops being physically pushed to the edge of Roman towns to keep the smell away from decent society. The Book of Acts even describes the Apostle Peter staying with Simon the tanner, whose house was, tellingly, located by the sea, likely so he could use seawater in his work, and likely kept at the edge of town both for the smell and for his constant physical contact with animal carcasses, which made him ritually unclean under Jewish law. That contradiction, the trade everyone depended on, run by people nobody wanted living next door, would follow leather across the Atlantic and straight into the modern world. It hardened into law in medieval Europe. As towns organized themselves into guild systems from around the 12th century onward, tanning was formally treated as one of the unclean trades, grouped in the public mind and often in municipal ordinances alongside butchers and cloth dyers. City governments across England, France, and Germany pushed tanneries downstream and outside the town walls entirely, partly to keep the smell away from wealthier residents, and partly because the tanning waste genuinely poisoned nearby water. A persistent piece of city folklore claims medieval towns pushed unpleasant trades to their eastern edge specifically because the prevailing wind in much of Western Europe blows from west to east, supposedly the origin of the posh West End. Working-class East End divide still visible in cities like London today. If you had actually stood inside a 14th century tannery, the process would have turned your stomach. Hides were soaked for days, sometimes left to partially rot on purpose, just to loosen the hair. Then came liming, a caustic bath that stripped away whatever hair and flesh remained. Then came the step that gave the whole trade its permanent reputation: baiting. Workers pounded fermented animal dung directly into the hide, or soaked it in a solution of dog droppings, pigeon manure, or hen droppings, left to ferment in warm water for days. Bacteria in the waste produced enzymes that broke down stubborn proteins, leaving the hide soft and pliable. Only after all of that did the leather go into pits filled with water and crushed oak bark for the actual tanning, a slow chemical process that could take anywhere from several weeks to well over a year for a single heavy hide. Nowhere does this get more literal than in Victorian London. By the 1700s and 1800s, English tanners producing fine, soft leather for gloves and bookbinding had settled on dog excrement as their baiting agent of choice, a substance the trade referred to using an old French-derived word pure. This single fact created an entire profession. Pure finders, almost always among London's poorest residents, walked the streets each day collecting dog droppings by hand and selling them by the bucket to tanners in leather districts like Bermondsey, on the south bank of the Thames. The social researcher Henry Mayhew, cataloging London's working poor in the 1850s, estimated a few hundred pure finders were supplying dozens of tan yards, each employing hundreds more workers. It sounds almost too strange to be true, and yet the logic was simple. Demand for soft, high-quality leather never stopped. Tanners paid real money for the raw material, and it was one of the only jobs open to people who had nothing else. The practice only started fading out in the very late 1800s, once German chemists worked out how to isolate the enzyme actually responsible, called pancreatin, and manufacture it industrially. For roughly 6,000 years, this was leather's technological ceiling on both sides of the Atlantic. Soak it, scrape it, bait it with waste, tan it slowly in bark for months. Every tannery needed a river, and every river downstream of one paid a price for it. Tanning crossed the Atlantic with the earliest European settlers, because a growing country needed the same things every civilization before it had needed boots, harnesses, saddles, and belting. By the 1800s, entire American towns had built their identity and their economy around it. Peabody, Massachusetts, became so dominated by the trade that it was known simply as the Leather City. Nearby Lynn built one of the young country's largest shoe industries on the leather coming out of New England's tanneries. And in the mountains of Appalachia, Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, an entire regional industry grew up specifically around the local hardwood forests, because vegetable tanning required tannic acid, and the bark of the American chestnut tree, abundant across that whole region, was one of the richest natural sources of it on Earth. One family caught up in this world produced an American president. Jesse Root Grant built a modestly successful tanning business in Point Pleasant, and then Georgetown, Ohio, and expected his oldest son to grow up and take it over. That son, Hiram Ulysses Grant, hated everything about it. He couldn't stand the smell, the skinning, the constant contact with dead animals and harsh chemicals. He spent his childhood finding any excuse to work the farm and the horses instead, and his father, recognizing his son had zero future as a tanner, eventually sent him off to West Point instead. Ulysses S. Grant went on to command the Union Army and become the 18th President of the United States, a path that started, in part, with a boy who simply refused to work in his father's tannery. That regional American tanning industry, built for over a century on Appalachian chestnut bark, is exactly what the blight discovered at the Bronx Zoo in 1904 destroyed. By the 1920s, the fungus had reached the southern Appalachians, the epicenter of America's tanbark extract industry. Timber companies, panicking, raced to strip every remaining infected tree for its bark before it became worthless. It didn't matter. Within a few more decades, the American chestnut was functionally extinct across its entire natural range, from Maine to Mississippi. An industry that had depended on a single tree species for the majority of its raw material simply ran out of that material, all at once, with no substitute growing anywhere nearby. Necessity changed what came next. Industrial demand changed it, and a handful of obsessive chemists changed it for good, right as America's own tanbark supply was collapsing. In 1858, a German chemist named Friedrich Knapp, working alongside the Swedish scientist Carl Hiltain Cavallius, discovered that chromium salts could tan a hide directly, with no bark and no months of waiting. An American chemist named Augustus Schultz refined and patented a reliable version of the process using chromium sulfate in the 1880s, and the very first commercial chrome-tanned leather in the world went into production in New York City in 1884. Within a single generation, chrome tanning had taken over the industry on both continents. What used to take 2 months in an oak bark pit could now be done in about a day. Chrome tan leather was lighter, more heat-resistant, and could be bonded directly to rubber soles using heat alone, without stitching, which slashed manufacturing costs at exactly the moment the world's shoe industry was exploding in size. For American tanneries that had just lost their entire chestnut bark supply to a fungus, chrome tanning didn't just arrive at a convenient time. It arrived at the only time that mattered. Today, well over 80% of the world's leather is chrome tanned, and the old bark pit tradition survives mostly as a boutique, premium alternative. The irony sits right at the center of the story. The chemical breakthrough that finally freed tanneries from needing rivers full of dung and rotting flesh, and from a forest of chestnut trees that no longer existed, simply replaced one pollution problem with another, arguably worse one. Now the waste running downstream contained chromium instead. America would get its own hard lesson about exactly what that meant, over a century later, in a quiet suburb outside Boston. Woburn, Massachusetts had been an industrial town for well over 150 years, home to a cluster of tanneries among its older industries. By the late 1970s, 2 municipal wells serving one neighborhood in East Woburn, known simply as Wells G and H, were discovered to be contaminated with industrial solvents, including trichloroethylene. A local mother named Ann Anderson, whose young son had been diagnosed with leukemia, began noticing an unusual number of other children in her neighborhood being diagnosed with the same rare disease. A later Harvard School of Public Health study found a statistically significant link between the contaminated wells and Woburn's elevated childhood leukemia rate, which researchers estimated ran as high as 4 times the national average. In 1982, a group of Woburn families sued 3 companies connected to the pollution, including the corporate owner of the John J. Riley Tannery, which sat near the contaminated wells. The case dragged on for years, drew national television coverage, and eventually became the basis for the best-selling book, and later film, A Civil Action. When the jury finally ruled in 1986, it found one of the 3 companies, a manufacturing plant that had been dumping industrial solvents behind its own building, liable for the contamination. It did not find the tannery's owner responsible for the specific chemicals linked to the leukemia cases. But separate federal investigations later found substantial chemical contamination on the tannery's own property as well, and the Environmental Protection Agency ultimately forced a cleanup of the whole area, one of the largest in the history of the northeastern United States, at a cost of tens of millions of dollars. Woburn was never as catastrophic, in scale, as the pollution crises playing out in tanning districts overseas. But it did something arguably more important for the American public. It put a tannery, and the century-old assumption that industrial waste was simply somebody else's problem, in front of a jury, in front of national television cameras, and in front of Congress, at the exact moment America was building the modern environmental and toxic tort legal system it still uses today. While America was industrializing leather production at enormous scale, Europe went the opposite direction and turned the same material into the foundation of the global luxury industry. Italian tanneries in Tuscany and the Veneto region built centuries of accumulated craft knowledge into a reputation that lets a handbag stamped made in Italy command prices unthinkable for the identical cut of leather tanned somewhere else. French fashion houses did the same, treating leather goods not as a commodity, but as the physical expression of heritage and craftsmanship. A single calfskin handbag from one of these houses can retail for tens of thousands of dollars, literally thousands of times the value of the raw hide it started as. Today, the global leather goods industry is worth somewhere north of $500 billion a year, spanning footwear, furniture, automotive interiors, and fashion, and the United States alone represents one of its single largest consumer markets on Earth, driven by everything from work boots to premium handbags to the leather seats inside American-made cars and trucks. Leather's footprint reaches far past shoes and handbags. It's the default material inside a huge share of the world's cars, chosen for durability and for a specific smell manufacturers spend real money trying to preserve or artificially recreate for buyers who now expect it. It has been central to bookbinding for centuries, in the form of tanned leather covers and vellum, protecting some of the oldest surviving manuscripts on Earth. American and European militaries alike have depended on tan leather for boots, saddlery, and equipment belting for as long as those militaries have existed. Even the chemistry itself outlived the trees that once fed it. The same tannin extraction techniques the chestnut industry perfected eventually found their way into glues, dyes, and specialty papers, a quiet reminder that leather was never really one single product, but a whole branch of applied chemistry that happened to start with somebody's dinner scraps. The 21st century has finally started producing a real American attempt at solving leather's pollution problem, rather than simply outsourcing it. Companies working with mycelium, the root-like network mushrooms grow from, have spent the last decade trying to grow a leather substitute in a matter of days instead of raising an animal for years. Two of the best-funded companies in this new field, Bolt Threads and Myco Works, both started in the same stretch of Northern California that gave the world Silicon Valley, and both have supplied materials to major fashion houses for handbags, sneakers, and even concept car interiors, grown in trays from agricultural waste instead of pulled from a cow. It has not been a smooth transition. Bolt Threads suspended production of its Milo material entirely in 2023 after struggling to raise enough money to scale, even with luxury brand partnerships already signed. Myco Works has kept going, opening a large-scale production facility in South Carolina, though it has since scaled back its own ambitions too. Mycelium leather still typically costs several times more per square foot than conventional cowhide, mostly because growing and processing it at industrial scale remains far harder and far more expensive than raising cattle and running a tannery, a system humanity has now spent roughly 8,000 years optimizing. Whether American biotechnology can outcompete that 8,000-year head start on price alone is a fight the industry is having right now, in real time. Picture that forester at the Bronx Zoo again, in 1904, staring at strange orange cankers on a chestnut tree, with absolutely no idea he was looking at the end of an entire American industry. What killed those trees wasn't some new, modern poison. It was an accident, a fungus hitching a ride on imported nursery stock, doing what fungi do. But the chemical industry that rose up to replace what those trees once provided, chrome tanning, invented in Europe, patented and first commercialized in New York, embraced by American tanneries the moment they had no other choice, created the exact kind of waste that would end up in two contaminated wells in Woburn, Massachusetts, 80 years later, and in the bloodstreams of children who had done nothing but drink their own tap water. What actually changed across 8,000 years was never really the chemistry. It was who profits from the finished result and who is forced to live downstream of the process that makes it. A trade once ranked below dung collecting, legislated outside city walls, and kept alive in Victorian London by children scavenging dog waste off the street, now anchors handbags that sell for the price of a car, boots that outfit armies, and seats in nearly every car built in America. The smell never actually left the industry. It just got pushed far enough away from the people buying the final product that they stopped having to smell it at all. If you enjoyed this, hit subscribe, and let us know in the comments which part of leather's history surprised you the most.